All right, I didn't do that. So, peace, y'all. Welcome to another episode of the Edible Activist Podcast. You would think after doing this for quite some time, you would get it right. But you know what? I didn't get it right this time, but we're going to move forward. Welcome back, y'all. I know I've been on break for a little bit, but we are back with our episodes and here with the podcast. Excited as always to bring you another really dynamic show. You know how we roll. Just a few reminders at the top of the show. If you have not subscribed to our podcast, please do subscribe. You can find Food Talks in Color on YouTube. So just go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Also, after you've watched an episode, go ahead and like the video if you like what you saw, comment, and also share. Sharing is caring, and it helps with the algorithm. I know it's a word that I don't necessarily like to use, or people just cringe when they hear the word algorithm, but it really does help with numbers. So if you have not subscribed, I'm going to say it again. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, share with a friend, have them subscribe as well. Like and comment. It all counts. All right. So I'm not going to be before you long. We're actually going to go ahead and get started. Oh, my last thing too. We're also on iTunes. So not only do you have the opportunity to actually watch the show on YouTube Live, you can still listen to this podcast, the Edible Activist Podcast on iTunes. And we're also on Spotify as well. But on iTunes, give us a really great rating. You can also rate, you can, share what your experience has been in listening to these episodes. So we're not just on YouTube, we're on iTunes as well. So go ahead and see us there. We're at 130 episodes, something to celebrate, in episode 131 today. So alrighty, y'all. So for today's show, we are talking about how cities can improve our food system, right? We know we still have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of amazing people who are shepherding this movement on the ground every single day in their communities, in their respective neighborhoods across the globe. But the public, citizens, people like me, who live in the city, we have an opportunity to help support improving our food system. And so we're going to have a really great conversation. More specifically, we're going to talk about New York City. We're going to speak to New York City. I have a really great guest who I'm going to bring on in just a minute. But just as a very brief intro, so I have for today's show Ribka Getachew, who is an NYC food justice organizer. She is also the director of the Good Food Purchasing Program campaign at Community Food Advocates, which is based in New York City. So we're going to get a little bit more into that. We're going to be talking about all things procurement. We're going to be talking about supporting small scale farmers. We're going to be talking about environmental sustainability and how we can just really support the values that we all believe in, and how cities can improve our food system by supporting these businesses and really getting them, in the process, in government, in local government, for the people, right? So putting good food before us. So we're going to talk more to that. But without further ado, I'm going to invite my guest on the show, Ribka. Hi. Oh, y'all, I didn't do my job today. I told Ribka that I was going to unmute her, and I didn't. Charge my head, not my heart. Ribka, welcome to the Edible Activist Podcast. So good to have you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Absolutely. I was really excited as Ripka and I were chatting just a few moments before. And, there's so many people who I want to meet. There's so many great people doing wonderful things, in this movement and on the ground. And so whenever I have an opportunity and someone say, hey, I think you should have this guest on the show, I'm just amazed, because number one, I'm honored, that someone will find little old me, all right, this little old podcast, and say, hey, I really think that, this would bring another really great perspective to the show. So I'm excited that everything was in alignment and that you're here and we can share your voice, Ribka. So we're going to dive in, because that's what we do here in this episode. Let's do it. You are doing really great things. You have been in the food space for a long time. And so, I just want to congratulate you, because
thank you.
Your work is great.
Thank you.
Your work is
I
great.
appreciate that.
Yes,
I appreciate and receive that.
Yes, and nobody else. If you didn't hear from anyone today, you heard it from Melissa L. Jones. Keep up the great work, because our change agents need to hear more of that. Fixing our food system, is healing our food system is
Yes.
not an easy thing to do. And then when we're also talking about cities specifically,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
how cities can transform our food systems, like that's a whole nother ball game, right? Like how can we use
Yeah.
public dollars,
Yes.
to really like support, our farmers and support, the things that we really value when it comes to our food. So we're going to get into that. But first, let's start with your why. Let's start a little bit with your background and your why, like how you got
Yeah.
into this space, how what brought you here. I know food is important to you, but like,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate us starting with this question because, I really believe that why we step into this work really defines how we step through this work. And, for me, it's really been two-pronged and probably really multi-pronged. But if I would just whittle it down, I would say that on one hand, I've been an organizer in different capacities for years now. My work really started about over a decade ago, organizing as someone who had and who has an abolitionist lens, working alongside at the time formerly and currently incarcerated people to really transform their lived experiences. And to transform our carceral system and how we think about carcerality in this country. And working with this population day in and day out, I really saw and experienced how rampant food security was and still is. Um, and I really started to grapple with the questions of prison condition, the connection, really between prison conditions and the disproportionate numbers of Black and Brown people in prison and jail settings. And I realized through this work that that wasn't disconnected, for example, from the realities of the poor quality of food that's sold in our neighborhood grocery stores. None of these issues are siloed. No social justice issue is disconnected from the next one. Um, but also, while exploring this, I myself was also dealing with a benign tumor in my knee for
Wow.
several years, and because the medical industrial complex is real, and because that's a whole other conversation,
Yes, it
and
is.
and because in my case conventional medication just didn't work for me. I had to simultaneously, as a young Black woman, I had to simultaneously really uncover the ways in which I had the inherent power to work towards healing myself. And these
Wow.
two
Mm,
really, really real experiences that I was having at the same time really illuminated the power of transforming our food system to one that's rooted in abundance and food sovereignty, and that's centered in truly supporting the power and the well-being of our communities. And that whole narrative and that those set of experiences and then some is really what brought me to the work that I do today.
oh my goodness. Listen, Ribka, I feel like, and not to take us totally off because I can do that, I can totally do that. But your experience in working with incarcerated individuals and working within the prison system, just thinking about, you had mentioned the conditions. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
food in itself, obviously is just a whole, can be a whole nother conversation. There are a multitude
Yeah.
of conversations that can be held about our
Yeah.
incarceration, system. But
Yeah.
I thank you for sharing that with me because it is always the thing that is the thorn or the thing that's nudging us or the thing that we're having to battle and combat and the thing that
Mm-hmm.
that leads us to this
Yeah.
space to really just do some really powerful things. And I think not that I think I believe it's super important to always connect the present with the past of the why. And where was I 15, 10 years ago when this whole thing sparked, or when I was having issues with my knee. I think that's super important. That's why I start with that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. So
I
um,
appreciate that.
yes, absolutely. Let's talk about community food advocates in
Yeah.
this value based program. And so let's start with community food advocates first. This is the
Yeah.
organization that you're a part of in New York City, and then we'll morph into the campaign that you have been leading, and we'll dig more from there.
Okay. Yeah. So, I'll just start this by saying that I recognize that our community's relationship to government is really complicated,
Oh my
to say the
gosh,
least.
Rika. Oh my God. I'm sorry. I
It's
have to
so
pause
layered.
you.
No, go ahead.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. Thank you for saying that.
Mm,
Yes.
and it's something that, you know, we have to just grapple with, when, because it's so easy to talk about policy and to forget about the reality that it's not easy. I mean, you started off by saying that working in this space is not easy, and that's why I really appreciated you starting with the question of why, because it's really the answer to that question that really moves us through the really trying moments, the moments where we feel jaded, the moments where we maybe feel like change isn't possible. And it's the why is really what allows us to dream. I feel what allows me to dream, what allows me to envision what I'm working towards day in and day out. And so I just wanted to start by saying that and to acknowledge that. I know my relationship to government is really complicated. And there are days that I genuinely feel like, what are we doing? And I
Mm,
and I think wrestling with those questions is really important. And something that I'm encouraged by, though, I will say, is it's something that we recognize at community food advocates organizationally and personally, is that we believe that our government truly has a fundamental responsibility to its people and an unmatched capacity to transform our food system and to
absolutely.
ultimately work towards ending poverty and hunger. And our work at community food advocates really is at the intersection point between advocating for high impact, meaningful food policy and building really, really strategic coalitions. We work in partnership with members of our community across New York City and New York State to censor the truth that those closest to the problem are the ones that are closest to the solution. And if we're
Mm,
not doing that, then we're really missing the mark. And we're not really holding our government accountable to what our communities truly need. And so that's really the heart of what community food advocates is, and the reason why I believe in this work, and and is part of what drives me day in and day out.
wow. Wow. I again, I thank you so much for the setting the tone, or not even necessarily setting the tone, but just really creating this transparency and that understanding
Mm,
that the relationship between people and government is a very complicated one. I said because it could
yeah,
probably be very challenging to hear
yeah,
the work of government and just the intro that you provide and just people making that connection because there are probably questions of like government don't work for me, government
yeah,
does nothing
totally.
for me. That is the belief for many citizens who live here.
I
Like,
get it. I
yes,
get
I
it.
do
I get it.
too.
Yeah.
I do
I get
too.
it. And
Yeah.
people, when you think about what your values are just as a person, as a human being, when I ask myself that question, one of the key values that I center in all of my relationships, from my interpersonal relationships to my relationship to government, is
Mm-hmm.
accountability. And
Mm,
that's a two-way street. And part of the work that we do is really continually asking ourselves, how can we hold government accountable? And that's not facetious, that's not theoretical. That's how can we do that in practice and in a way that censors our perspectives and our expertise as folks who are residents, just moving through their day-to-day lives.
absolutely. Oh, a word and can be a whole nother conversation, right? A whole nother
it,
conversation.
it really is.
All right. Well, you have been, again, I've said this before, you've been doing some really amazing things. And so, one of the things that, community food advocates is this values based procurement food model that you have
Yeah,
been leading. And so, which was very interesting when I first learned about this, right? I mean, it's no secret that we want great food for everybody, right? But then when we
yeah,
are pulling in government and we're talking procurement and who we're buying from, and if anybody is familiar with the procurement process, which I am, and it was a not a fun one, and just really understanding how government operates when it comes to procurement, which is a whole nother thing too. When we're talking about like equity
Yeah.
and procurement,
Yeah,
whole nother conversation, right? But
it
some of the
is.
things that you all are working with is going to help support that, when it comes to equity and supporting small scale farmers, BIPOC farmers,
Hmm.
really tying in sustainability and making sure that we are buying into, things that are healthy, nutritious, but also support, the residents who live here and the people who are doing the work, So let's talk about this. Let's break this down a little
Yeah.
bit further. Let's talk
Yeah.
procurement first for those who aren't familiar with procurement, and that's totally fine because there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. Let's and you whatever flow you want, actually, whatever makes sense first,
Yeah.
Ripka. But I really do want to make sure that people have an understanding of like procurement, and then really diving into what does this mean, for a small scale farmer? What does this mean for the public? What does this mean for a small business? Like what?
Yeah.
So, um,
Yeah. Yeah. All of these
God.
are really, really great questions that we grapple with day in and day out. But just to really, try and whittle it down as much as possible, we lead the New York City and the New York State Good Food Purchasing Program campaigns. And that's a mouthful of a title. So just, like you said, to break it all down, the Good Food Purchasing Program is a program that started actually in LA over a decade ago at this point, about a decade ago, and has since found its way across many cities. And we'll talk a little bit about its reach a little bit later on, probably.
Yep.
But the Good Food Purchasing Program really, at its heart, transforms the way that public institutions or agencies purchase food by creating a transparent and equitable food system that's really built on five core values. So the pillars of the program are supporting our local economies, our local food economies, nutrition and the health and well-being of our people, valued workforce, and ultimately, do we support our workforce across the supply chain from farm to fork?
Mm.
How well are our animals treated? Do we center and prioritize vendors that uphold animal welfare principles? And environmental sustainability, like you mentioned earlier, is another central value to the Good Food Purchasing Program. The question that we're really seeking to answer in using this program as a tool in New York City and ultimately across New York State is how can we create more opportunities and pathways for farms and other food businesses that uphold these values, particularly as they try to undergo the very multi-layered process of getting contracts with our public agencies or institutions. And I said that word earlier, and I'll just break that down just to get to the heart of what we're talking about. We're talking about schools that use public taxpayers' dollars, hospitals, senior centers, homeless shelters, jails, and detention centers, and other agencies across our city and across our state that use our dollars as public taxpayers to buy and to serve food to its residents.
Mm-hmm.
The Good Food Purchasing Program, if I were to just whittle it down to its heartbeat, really, it aims to, on one hand, really hold large vendors accountable to better practices, while also ensuring that small and historically marginalized vendors like BIPOC food producers, Black, Indigenous, and other POC farmers and food producers actually have more opportunities to contract with our public agency. And
Mm-hmm.
and so it's really multi-layered. Um, but you asked about procurement too, right? And that word gets thrown around a lot, and it's really wonky, and it's something that I
It is
contend with.
wonky, Ribka. It's wonky.
It's
I don't even like saying this. Listen, this is coming from someone who had a business for 10 years, okay? And I've had a contract, with the government here, and I mean, I have to say it was not a friendly process, and
I
just
I
really
hear you.
understanding the procurement process of like how they do the bids, and it just really goes to like
Yes.
whoever's saying, okay, I'm going to do this for like 5 cents, and like just think
Yeah.
of that, like if you were a food producer and like you were, you know, if y'all eat bologna sandwiches, that's fine. That's whatever. I'm just using it as an example. There's no
Yeah.
judgment here. Okay. Right. I know what bologna
Yeah.
tastes like, but like, that's just the reality of it. And so this really is just exciting because this is really opening up the doors, for,
Yeah.
as just the aforementioned, folks and businesses that you had mentioned, but no, procurement is wonky. It's okay.
It's
It
so
is.
it's so wonky, and I have been doing this work for a while now, and it's still wonky to me. So let me just also start by saying that. And honestly, the quote unquote experts in procurement, they're also learning day in and day out because it's so multi-layered. And so I just want to censor that. It's not particularly easy to understand. But one thing that if I could just contextualize this real quick is, when I think of the Good Food Purchasing Program, I really think of it as a tool to amplify the power of our communities so that they have a say in determining the food purchasing decisions that are made by our public agencies. Because, what I said earlier is true that they're using our public taxpayers' dollars day in and day out to make food decisions, and we should have a say in that. And so the Good Food Purchasing Program really centers values that have been determined to be important to our communities, and that's what gets censored as we advocate for the implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program. But I just wanted to lay that out on the table, and start with that before I get into what procurement is. But I'll just say that procurement, if I were to just break it down, it's really all of the processes and decisions that go into determining which vendor, in this case, which vendor a public agency will purchase from. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like you mentioned, bidding, there's an extensive bidding process. A bid has to be written that lays out all of the different specifications that an agency wants in that particular food product or from that particular vendor. So when I say procurement or leveraging the power of procurement, that's the process that I'm talking about, that goes all the way to the time at which the contract is actually signed with the vendor and the time that that contract is actually fulfilled. Um, if I that even in even that sounds a little bit wonky. Um,
It's just
when
giving me a little bit of anxiety and a bit triggering just as someone who's gone through the process before.
I
But it's
I
not your
I,
fault, Ripka.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that transparency too, and I appreciate that perspective. I like to try and get even simpler. I oftentimes talk about leveraging the power of procurement. That's what we think of the Good Food
Mm,
Purchasing Program as. How do we leverage the power of procurement, and what does that even mean? When we say that, we're saying that because large public institutions spend so much money on food, that food related companies, from food producers and farmers to processors and distributors, become reliant on the business from these institutions, or public agencies like your schools, hospitals, etc.
mm-hmm.
And because of this, the agencies can influence those companies to adhere to practices or values that are in line with that agency's priorities. Now, that agency's priorities could simply be selecting the vendors that offer the lowest price or that uphold different values, like the values that I had mentioned earlier.
Right,
And,
right.
when we talk about GFPP, or the Good Food Purchasing Program, as a tool, we're recognizing that agencies can ultimately threaten to withdraw their business from a company if that company doesn't comply with the agency's priorities, and ultimately, hopefully, the values and the priorities of the communities that they're serving. And so, in saying that, we know that agencies have power over those companies' behaviors or practices, and can ultimately encourage broad change across the food system by actively choosing, and I stress actively choosing
I
to
felt
invest
the
their dollars.
force. I felt the emphasis behind actively. I
I
felt
was
that, sis.
trying. I was trying. By actively choosing to invest their dollars in companies that demonstrate a commitment to these values. And so that's a little bit about what what really drives us to do the work that we're doing here in New York City and New York State.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So much to unpack. It is so
Yeah.
much to unpack. So, what does this mean for what is the, so I'm a farmer. I'm a
Mhm.
small scale farmer. I'm a black woman, black female farmer. I grow microgreens. I grow
Mhm.
something of abundance where I'm really looking to supply my product to. Like, what is the, I guess, in terms of like your vision or your dream, like what is like that, if I'm a small scale farmer, like how is this
Mhm.
all going to make me feel? And if when I hear
Yeah.
this, am I really like, is this just another one of these, like, because again, we talked
Yeah.
about government and we talked about
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
complicated relationship, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But like, what is your hope that someone like, I'm not a farmer, y'all. Let me just say that. I think y'all know that. But someone like me, I hear this. Like, what is your hope that what is this going to do for me? Like, what is the dream? What is the
Yeah.
hope? Like, what, yeah, what is that? What does that feel like?
Yeah.
Because there
I
has
love this.
not been many, not to me, I had, this is my first conversation about this. So again, I'm very excited that we are diversifying the conversations and really talking about
Mhm.
this. This is a first, right? We don't talk about this too much often at all, So not even with the farmers that I know, we're not talking
Mm.
about this,
Yeah.
We're not. We're just talking about building infrastructure for their farm, feeding their
Mhm.
community, and that's as far as it
Mhm.
goes. So what does that feel like? What hope do you want this farmer or this food business, to have in hearing this and pushing this movement through?
Yeah, let me just say that I really appreciate you lifting up the idea of hope and dreaming in this, because this is really a paradigm shift that we're trying to
Mm,
work towards. This is very different than what our agencies have been doing. Even in if I would just talk a little bit about New York City and New York State has some of the most restrictive procurement law. And to use that wonky word again, we have some of the most restrictive procurement law in the country, and it hasn't been updated since the 70s, so over 50 years at this point.
yeah, I read
And
that. I'm like, well, I'm not surprised, but there's still things that you're never surprised about. But so when you read it, you're just like, oh my gosh. But anyway, yeah.
yeah, no, it's absurd, really. We New York and actually Illinois has some of the most restrictive procurement law across the country.
Mm,
And when I say that, I mean that public agencies are actively required by state law to select what they call the lowest responsible bidder, or just simply the lowest bidder, the bidder that's able to offer them the lowest price. And that ultimately does meet some parameters. Like, our public agencies are held to, depending on the agency, different state and federal requirement, city, state, and federal requirements. So that goes without saying, but ultimately they have to select the lowest bidder. And so one thing that we're working on, and then I'm going to get a little bit more into my dream and so on, but just to contextualize some of the tools that we're using to work towards that vision and that dream, is something that we're calling the Good Food and Why Bill in New York State. It's a bill that would be the first of its kind that would have in the country, that amends that really nitpicky part of New York state law that says that public
mm,
agencies have to select the lowest bidder. And it essentially says, the Good Food and Why Bill says that agencies are now allowed to award a bid, essentially give a contract to a qualified vendor who meets one or more of the values based criteria that we integrate into the bill. So, really centered around vendors that meet standards within the areas that I'd mentioned earlier, the value areas that I'd mentioned earlier. So, local economies, animal welfare, environmental sustainability, nutrition and valued workforce, and racial equity as well. And in this case, which is an alternative than what is the status quo right now, under this bill, successful contracts would be given preference over other bidders, particularly the lowest bidders, so long as they can offer a cost that's no greater than 10% than the cost included in the bid from the lowest bidder. So it
Mm-hmm.
essentially allows agencies to pay a little bit more for vendors that align with their values and that ultimately work towards the food systems change that's important to them as an agency and that's important to the residents that they're serving. Another
Wow.
major piece of this bill is that let me just say that the food system is opaque. And when I say that, I mean that we do not know where our food comes from. And public agencies are not currently required to ask for full supply chain data from farm all the way to fork. And so what we're doing with this bill, sorry, the Good Food NY bill, is now all bidders will be required to include in their bid, in their response to the bid, relevant supply chain data like name and addresses, etc.,
Hmm.
of all of the producers, suppliers, distributors, and aggregators that are involved in actually bringing this food from the farm to our plates. And
Wow.
that is so key because that's how we enact change. You've centered transparency in this podcast and in this conversation, which I've really appreciated you lifting up because that's one of the central pieces of how we use the Good Food Purchasing Program to work as a tool that amplifies the power of the community. If our communities don't know where our food is coming from, we can't say where we think our food should be coming. And so
Wow.
it's really important for that picture to be painted using that data. And that's one of we've recognized a really truly integral and primary component to how we organize around this. Um,
Wow.
so I just that was a lot. I just wanted to start with that.
I'm soaking it
Um,
all in. I mean, Ribka, you are just brilliant over here. I'm just soaking all of this in. No, this is great. This is so
I
great. And it's a
appreciate
lot of
I
work. I know
appreciate
it's a lot of work. So when we
it
think
is.
about, one of the things that I know that's been lifted up and is part of this work is addressing, systemic racism. Do
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
truly believe that, this bill and this effort would, you know, support longstanding issues when it comes to the inequities of our food system, of us as Black people and people of color.
Hmm.
And so I and how is that a constant, um are those conversations, constant? Are those conversations always
Yeah.
revolving, when you all are discussing this bill and discussing, the campaign?
Yeah, that's so spot on. And it is something that, I ask myself day in and day out, that our team asks ourselves day in and day out, and that our coalition does too, along with honestly the legislative partners that we work with too. I'll just say, no one policy is a silver bullet. I recognize that. And when I say that, I really mean that no one thing addresses everything in our society. And recognize and addresses all of the social inequities that we're working towards. So that's just generally how I feel, and I say that with a comma at the end of that sentiment, and I say that I recognize that this bill and all of the work that we're doing with the Good Food Purchasing Program and trying to maximize it and spread it across not only the state but really the country is that this works as part of a larger ecosystem really amazing work that's happening day in and day out to make more pathways and provide more opportunities for Black farmers and other POC farmers across our state, across our country. You mentioned that one of the central conversations that you've had is around infrastructure. That's a big piece of this equation. We hear day in and day out that some of the primary challenges that Black farmers, for example, face are access to land, access to capital, and access to infrastructure. And those are all really real things that we have to contend with when doing this work. Because, if we're creating more market opportunities, if we're calling on our public agencies to source more of their produce from BIPOC food producers, we have to also be actively working with folks who are supporting those BIPOC food producers to actually be able to scale up. But let just to quantify that a little bit, because I think some numbers can be really helpful in understanding what we're up against. And just to look at the United States at large, and then I'll whittle it down a little bit to New York State. A century ago, so back in 1920, black farming, that's when black farming peaked. And I'm sure a lot of folks that are listening are really well aware of these stats. But I'll just say there were at that time in 1920 close to 1 million black farmers, which is astounding. If we compare that to today, that's compared to only 48,000 black farmers across the country. And when you break that down even more, black farmers across the country only own 0.5% of the farmland in this country. It's 0.5% of the farmland in this country. In New York State alone, we have only 139 black farmers compared to
Wow.
57,000 white farmers. 57,000 white farmers. Those numbers,
That
you
is alarm. I haven't heard the New York City, New York State. Did you say state?
New York State,
New
New
York
York
State.
State.
I have never heard that stat, and like that is alarming.
It's alarming, it's absurd, and honestly, it's by design. That I felt that deep
Of
breath. That's,
course.
that's
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I
I
got deep sighs for days, girlfriend. Oh,
so do I.
absolutely. Yes.
That's me on the daily, honestly. And we know that these issues are inherent to the legacy of agriculture, which is inherently tied to the legacy, the very raw, ugly legacy of slavery in this country. Those issues of access to land, capital, infrastructure, those are some of the biggest challenges, and that is entirely by design, and it's what makes PLC farmers and black farmers scaling up really challenging, which is something that we actively have to contend with when, like I said earlier, we're actively telling agencies and public institutions to use their tremendous dollars to source from these producers. So we don't shy away from that reality, and it's something that really drives me. When I think of New York City alone, who is actively, we're doing tremendous work with implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program. We've been working very closely with our agencies, our public agencies, to advance this program and to really maximize this program. But to just give you a sense of how much we're spending in New York City alone, just New York City. New York City, we have 11 public agencies that we're targeting, and collectively, we spend annually $500 million on food alone across those 11 agencies. That's a tremendous amount of money. So when I said that we have the power to leverage the power of procurement, I, that's no easy task when you're talking about $500 million or $500 million. Um, we are also, serving the most marginalized people
Yeah.
in our city, and
Yeah.
in our state too. These public agencies, from schools to detention centers and jails, to hospitals, homeless shelters, senior centers, etc. They're serving the people who have been pushed to the periphery of our society, and who have a tremendous amount of power inherently, but who have been ultimately given the least amount of say in determining their food realities in their communities. And so
Mm.
this the Good Food Purchasing Program is one of a number of tools that we can use to support the process of amplifying that community power, to say that they deserve a say in centering the values that are important to them in the food that comes into their public institutions. But
Mm.
we also care about, like you mentioned, Black farmers, and we recognize, like I said earlier, that this works within a larger ecosystem. So we are constantly talking with stakeholders in the city, and ultimately now we've been building an active campaign across the state to make sure that that ecosystem is supported, so that there's constant feedback loops happening between our agencies and what they're demanding, and who they're preferring in the food purchasing decisions that they're
Mm-hmm.
making, and ultimately making sure that the other side of the supply chain is ready, willing, interested, and able to respond to bids, and to ultimately serve members of the community that want to be, eating the food that comes from them.
Yeah, when you were, speaking a few moments ago, and just I remember my experience a few years ago, Ripka. I was volunteering at a shelter,
Hmm.
and when I tell you the food that I saw being served, I said, "How? How?
I
We are
know.
already in a space of trauma, folks,
Hmm.
dealing with mental issues. And you would think
Hmm.
that at the top, I understand. Listen, I'm not discrediting anybody, for wanting to, they're there to serve, right? They're like, listen, we just want to fill their bellies. Like they need food, they need a place to stay. But the food that I saw, I said, oh my goodness.
Hmm.
Oh my
Hmm.
goodness. Then I've actually worked with other shelters who are actually very intentional about the food.
Hmm.
They have gardens,
Hmm.
here in DC
Yeah.
have gardens, they are serving pasta with fresh vegetables and herbs. But I remembered my first experience like it was yesterday. And this was even before I had any connection in this space. And that was one of the
Yeah.
first things that I thought about. And I said, I do not know how this food is being served right now because
Yeah.
I would not even eat this. And so
Yeah.
I think yes, we are talking about the impact that this would definitely have on food businesses, with the health and wellness lens, small scale farmers, BIPOC farmers, but also those who are receiving the food, those on the other end as
Yeah.
well. And so I couldn't help but to think about that as you were talking, and I hadn't thought about that in a minute, but I now remember, and so just even instances like that, I'm just thinking just how major this
Yeah.
campaign is, and how vital this would be, and so yeah, I just want to share that because it's not just one side, it's not just one person benefiting, it's just not one group of folks, just benefiting. It's on both ends, and so I just wanted to share
Hmm.
that and also just in gratitude, which is how
Hmm.
for you all, community food advocates, to you and this entire campaign, and just really pushing this forward. And so, with that said, what you had said earlier is that this had started in LA. Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
Something like
Yeah.
this, a model like this started in LA, and so I'm very
Yeah.
interested to learn like how this is panned out for LA, and how success in other cities or cities who are looking to approach a similar model as well,
Yeah.
because we want this to spread. We want this to
Yeah.
spread. And so, and if there's any, and I don't know, and just because I don't know everything, there could be some things that I'm not thinking about that, some folks may be scratching their head around. Like, I don't know about, like, I also just want to be sensitive to that too, because I feel like there are different perspectives, and, people view, campaigns like very differently. But from what I'm hearing and what I've read, like, this is really going to be a game changer. Not only that,
Yeah.
every time I get my paycheck, I question even more. What y'all doing with my dollars? Okay. What are y'all doing with
That's
my
so
money?
real.
And if
That
you
is
want to do
so
something
so
with
real.
it, like really invest in the folks
Yeah.
who are doing this really good, great work. Okay. Like, please.
Exactly. 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 And you spoke to a very real tension point. A couple moments ago, you mentioned how it's on one hand really important that folks that are utilizing public institutions for food are getting a meal to fill their bellies, and to support them shifting away from a state of hunger, however that may look.
Yes.
But the other side of that is the what in terms of what does that supply chain look like that's supplying that food, and what is the nature and the quality of that food that's on their plate. And we wrestle with that, day in and day out.
Mm.
um, one of the things that we hear, like from schools, for example, one of the active campaigns that folks know us for here in New York City is our Lunch for Learning campaign, which advocated for a number of years to get universal free school meals here in New York City. And we won that back in 2017. Before, kids were separated in the classroom based on who had the ability to afford their school lunch,
Mm-hmm.
and who didn't. And now that's not the case. And what we hear from a number of folks is that the meals that their kids, or that they themselves, if we're hearing from students, that they're receiving in schools, are sometimes their primary or their only meal that they're getting on a
That is
day.
real.
And
That is a reality. Yes.
it's truly a reality, and it's something that causes that tension point, when we're actively talking about how do you center that truth with the reality that our food system needs to change to support the foods that are going onto their trays and onto their plates. um, and
Mm-hmm.
this is, like I said earlier, a paradigm shift. This can't happen in silos. We can't be doing this by ourselves. And just to go back to LA started to implement this about a decade ago. And then other cities started to realize that this idea of centering values in food purchasing in public agencies was really important for them to bring to their cities, to their neck of the woods, or to their neck of the United States. And so now, at present, there are approximately 60 or so agencies that are actively implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program. And this is across 11 and 11 coalitions are activating around this, including ours in New York City and New York State. And this covers 24 cities.
Wow.
So we're talking about cities like Chicago, Buffalo, Austin, Boston,
Is DC on that
Cincinnati,
list? I live in DC
DC. Shout
all
outs to
day.
DC.
Oh, okay.
I,
Now I
I,
know.
I DC has an active campaign. They're doing a lot of great work down there.
That's good
We're
to know.
actively, yeah, we're actually there's a massive network of good food purchasing folks that are working across the country. We're in constant communication to learn from each other, to share best practices. I've spoken to DC very recently, actually. I was just on a phone call with our partners from Chicago earlier yesterday, from our with our folks in Buffalo earlier today. So we're constantly in communication, and collectively, these cities have committed to the Good Food Purchasing Program, and we represent a combined total, roughly, of about $1 billion of food purchase from vendors that really uphold those five values that I mentioned. And that's pretty significant. And I'll just also give another shout out to Illinois. I'd mentioned earlier that they have, alongside New York State, they have some of the most restrictive procurement law, which
Hmm.
again requires that their public agencies have to select the lowest bidder. And they've also been doing some really interesting work on the state level, where they recently just enacted what they're calling the Better School Lunches Act, which is essentially targeting school districts and removes the requirement that they have to select the lowest bidder when specifically working with food service management companies. And that's really big. That's really big. And I wanted to lift that up because I wanted to just center the reality that this is possible. And in New York, with our work with the Good Food NY bill, that is seeking to reduce barriers across all municipalities and make sure that municipalities or cities have more options to do values-based food procurement. It's possible. But we talk to legislators across our Senate, across our Assembly, and we've received an overwhelming amount of support here in New York State on this. And it's been really interesting to see that, particularly with COVID and the pandemic being a backdrop to a lot of these conversations, they're realizing that the food system is very um, nimble, and they saw how precarious it was, how sensitive the food system is. At the start of the pandemic, a lot of people couldn't get a lot of food products. They saw how
Nah,
weak some of
sis,
our
you couldn't get
supply chains were.
a head of lettuce. You couldn't even
Anything,
get a pack of
anything.
seeds.
Exactly,
I was calling my
exactly.
farm friends like, listen, I want to stroll up because the
and
mom and
and
pop stores don't even got it.
seriously, and
Nah, it was
and
real.
it is so real. I was experiencing it here. I live in Brooklyn. We were
Shout out
experiencing all.
BK.
Shout out.
I used to live in Brooklyn when I lived in New York, so I got to shout it
Oh, nice,
out.
nice, nice. I love Brooklyn. It's my heart. I'm from New York. My family's from Ethiopia. We've been here for a long time. So I come with a history of how New York City has evolved over the last couple decades, and also come with the conscientiousness of a food system rooted on the continent too. So I bring a lot of that to the table. But all of that to just say that the work that the work that we're doing with legislators also tries to tap into their personhood, their lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
They're legislators, yes, they're elected officials, but they're also people at the end of the day
Mm-hmm.
who have to go to the grocery store after work and go and cook a meal for their families. And they were experiencing some of what everything that we were experiencing with the food system. And so now, for an average legislator who might not have been thinking about the food system and its relevance to their day-to-day lives or their constituents' day-to-day lives, they just have a different ear to these
Mm-hmm.
issues now. And the pandemic just really set a really interesting, for lack of a better word, a really interesting backdrop to how we have these conversations and
Yeah.
communicate its urgency, to be
Yeah.
real.
Yeah. Oh, sis, you are doing it. Oh my gosh. Rebecca, I can talk to you all day about this,
I could
and
too.
I love this because, it's passionate is just not even the word that I feel is
Mm,
appropriate to use, but it just, just feel your energy and just everything that you're championing in this space. And because holding these conversations, anytime we're talking politics, anytime we're talking elected officials, anything, anytime
yeah,
we're talking, government, it is very tricky. It is very
it
tricky.
is. It's so
Um,
layered.
yeah, it's so layered because there's that trust. There is
Yeah,
there it's the lack thereof, that
yeah,
residents, have, and rightfully so, right? Just given the history,
exactly. Exactly.
so
Exactly.
I appreciate you because it is so important for people to see you as a black woman showing up in this
Mm,
space and leading, this campaign. And it's so inspiring because regardless of
mm,
how we feel about government, regardless of what our relationship is like, this is just super important. And so I'm glad that you are one of many faces. Let's shout out to all the other folks too, but
yeah.
specifically, a black person, just really leading efforts. It's really inspiring and it just added a
Mm,
whole nother, layer, or just another voice, into this space to talk about this. So I'm
mm.
super excited. Thank you for sharing. The cities didn't even. Well, I'm in the district. I got some more digging to do, right? I got some more digging to do, but also, yeah, I have so much learning to do, right?
Mm.
But I'm just thank you for sharing all of that and all of your knowledge. And there's actually so many other questions I want to ask you, but I have to have you back on the show now. You got to come back, but that's if you
I'm
want
up
to
for
come
it.
back,
I
you
do,
know.
I do, I do, and honestly, I'll just reciprocate that because gratitude really is important. And
Mm,
one, I receive everything you said. That means a lot because the work really is hard. And like I said earlier, it can be really easy to get jaded and to feel
mhm,
jaded and to have to contend with that in the work.
mhm,
And accountability can be really hard when you're feeling jaded, and might have blurriness when trying to center the dream and the vision of what we're working towards. And
mhm,
I feel really empowered day in and day out, and I receive my energy from those dreams and
mhm,
from the partnership that I truly center in this work. That's always guided me in all of my work for honestly as long as I can remember. Same with my curiosity, asking why, like you started, why can't we do this? Why can't we source from Black farmers? Why can't we center values? And sometimes asking those questions when you may not be getting all the answers that you want can be really hard. But I just want to say I received everything that you said, and I appreciate that. But I also wanted to shout you out. You know, this having a space where we can learn together, and because we're all learning.
Hmm.
You know, if I stop learning when I'm 50 or 60, then I feel like, life just ends at the point that you stop learning.
Absolutely.
and
Yes.
and so I never want to stop learning, and I feel like it's spaces like the one that you very intentionally have created, here in these 130 episodes, but I'm sure in your day-to-day conversations and building and organizing with folks, that has really allowed folks to be rooted in that shared curiosity and that shared learning. And shout outs to you as a Black woman who's doing that. I was so excited to come onto this, and just seeing your face on here. You're not only just a people person, and you create a space that is accessible, but you also dig. And as someone who is notoriously curious, I just love the questions that you ask, and that you
Thank
center
you.
and lift up. So I just wanted to reciprocate that too.
Absolutely. So funny thing, we're about to wrap up, y'all. So when I was little, my mom used to call me a little nosy thing because I looked at everyone. I would literally bump into a wall, like breaking my neck to like look at people. When something would pop off, I'm like looking, like literally. And you know how they always tell you to like when you get older, right? It's like as like that little child, like what did you like? You know, like what were
Yeah.
some of the things that you were into? And I always tell people, I was like, I was extremely curious. You know, I said my mother would call
Hmm.
it nosy, but I was like, I was really curious. And even up to this moment, like I am super curious. But I look back at my little self, and like I always wanted to know everything. And even if I didn't ask any
Yeah.
questions, I was like looking, I would be walking and looking at the same time, be like, so
Yeah.
I
I connect with
appreciate
that.
that.
You have a kindred spirit right here with you.
Yes, yes. If someone wanted to, so I got one final question because we need to
Mhm.
leave, our listeners with, an edible act that they can take right away, like after listening to this show. So I'm going to ask you that. I'm going to re-ask you that question. But if someone wanted to get in contact with you, what's the
Yeah.
best way to do that? So just if someone wanted to connect, and if you don't want them to connect with you, if you want them to come
No.
through me, if I need to make a connect, just let me know. But there may be someone who's listening has some more questions.
Yeah.
So what would be the best way?
Yeah, I'm definitely open to that. I love talking with folks, and really engaging with how this movement can spread, and how we can center values in our food systems work across the board, not just limited to public food purchasing. But my email, I can share my email. I can also put it in the chat, but it's rgetacho at foodadvocates.com. That's R for Ripka, and Getachew is my last name, which is GETACHEW at foodadvocates.org. Sorry, I might have said that.
No, you're good. You're good. And I'm actually going to, just so folks know how to spell your name, there you go.
Perfect.
I ain't gonna drop it in the chat though, because that will get broadcasted out to like thousands of people after we're done. And yeah, but also
Yeah.
if they go to Community Food Advocates,
Yeah.
I know you have a whole profile on there as well. So I'll drop that link in the chat too. So
Yes.
they can probably send like a message, to the organization wanting to connect with you. But repeat the email address just one more time in case folks are writing it down and so they can see your
Yeah.
name on the thing.
Okay. So it's R, for Ripka and Getachew. R Getachew. RGETACHEW at foodadvocates.org. And it's on the website, so you can access me through the website that you'll share, Melissa, on the chat.
Yep.
But
Just put
I'll,
it
I'll
in.
also just awesome, perfect, thanks. What I'll also just flag there on that website, if you scroll all the way to the bottom on the main page, you'll see a button that says "Join Our Movement," and you can click there to get added to our listserv. We're really intentional with our newsletters. We don't spam folks. We curate it pretty well, and it's the place that it's one of the places, outside of our coalition meetings, where we keep our community informed on everything that we're working on, and lift up ways that they can activate on continue building momentum in our food systems advocacy across the board. here in New York City and New York State. So if you click that join our movement button, you can get more information there. And then if I can also just lift up another quick edible act, particularly for those who are listed that are based here in New York, I highly recommend, and I'm going to preface this in a moment, but I highly recommend that you contact your local state senator and or assembly member to tell them to support the Good Food and Why bill. And I could put the bill numbers in the chat because they'll probably respond better to the actual bill numbers. But I preface that suggestion by just saying that I know that that sounds really daunting, or it could sound very daunting. Um, Calling our legislators can sound so arbitrary. It can be really daunting to have that conversation. I completely understand. It can sometimes feel really, really inaccessible. And we do have a tool, a type form that helps New York State residents find their local legislator, because sometimes it's hard to know where to find that information and what their contact information is, be it their number or their email. And it can also be really challenging to know exactly what to say to them, to express that you support the thing that you're calling about. So I'll just share this link. I believe you should be able to see it right now. It's a
I
type
think you
form.
put it in the private chat, but don't worry, I gotcha. I'm gonna put it in the main chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, not a
I'm
problem.
getting familiar with the platform.
That's okay.
Um,
I put it in there. Yep. Perfect.
and that you'll see, it really helps to just whittle that process down. And it provides a template for you to say, hey legislator, I care about this because of this. And you can add some things that bring in your own heart and your perspective, and the perspectives and feedback from your community. Of course, we love when folks make it their own. That's when it really registers. But there's a template that helps to communicate some of those ideas. And I'll just share it. It's included in the type form, but there's an info sheet that helps in a two page way, helps to really break down what the Good Food and Why bill is, how we're seeking to offer opportunities and options for cities across New York State to center and to lift up these values in their food purchasing decisions, and how racial equity and transparency is the two hearts of this work.
I love that. The two hearts. I love that. I love that. Ripka, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I mean that
It
from the
really
depths of my
has.
heart. Oh my gosh, so inspiring. So inspiring. Keep up the good work.
Thank
Like
you.
I
Thank you
we are
so
here,
much.
support this sister. Even if you don't live in New York, like send her good vibes because
I
she's
received
fighting for
that.
us. So, and you need that. You need that, and make sure you take care of yourself, self-care, because you know how we do. We carry the weight
Yes.
of the world and we push, push, push. But
Hmm.
I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I learned so much and I look forward to all the other work. I look forward to all the outcomes from the bill, the campaign. And I hope that you join me for a future show. I do.
I'm definitely up for it.
Yes, yes,
I'm saying
yes.
yes now.
Yes, yes.
Thank
That's okay.
you.
And if you change your mind in the future, I won't be offended, but I got you today. So,
This has been so great. I appreciate your energy. I
yes.
appreciate this space that you're creating for us, and just how you've lifted up so many truly inspirational voices over the lifetime of this chat. I mean, over the lifetime of this pandemic. And I'll just say, the past, it directly informs the present, which
Mm.
informs our future. And so from my perspective, I really feel like this podcast is one of so many feedback loops between the past, present, and future, and
Oh, yes.
just how we build. So thank you too
Ah,
for this space.
absolutely. Yes. All right. Y'all remember, if you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please find Food Talks in Color. That is just the letter N. So that's Food Talks in Color on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button. Like if you love, no, I don't think there's a love button on YouTube. YouTube yet, but just love it in your heart, right? Go ahead and love the show, comment, let us know what you enjoyed, and share it because it's super dynamic. This will also be on iTunes in the next couple of days too, if you want to hear the audio. But again, please subscribe, support the both of us. So you all have a wonderful evening, and we will talk to you all soon. Peace.
Peace. Thank you.